So like Shivani mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about accessibility, specifically accessibility beyond alt tags, back to basics. And what I want to get at here is we all, as sort of intermediate web developers, hear a lot about accessibility all the time, and certain points are hammered home, but there's a lot more to accessibility, and I think we know that there's a lot more to accessibility. And I want to give some sort of concrete foundations for what we can do with accessibility. So accessibility is a huge topic, certainly more than 25 minutes, and I expect to be learning about accessibility until the end of my career. So there's no way we can cover everything here, but we can have a good starting point. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about how to think about accessibility for the early intermediate web designer, kind of how to frame the topic in our minds, and some sort of benchmarks that we can aim for. We'll go into some really concrete accessibility checks for your website. We're going to jump into ARIA just a little bit, what ARIA is, and then eventually we'll talk about other tools that you can use to sort of do an audit on the accessibility of your website. So jumping right in, let's talk about how to think about accessibility for the early intermediate web developer. When you're thinking about accessibility, a great starting point is to ask the question, how are users going to interact with your website? And there's actually a lot to this. This is a big question to unpack. So how are users going to interact with your website visually? How are they going to see it? Are they going to be visually interacting at all? How are they going to be audibly interacting with your website? Are there audio cues that they need to worry about? Tactily, will they be using a keyboard? Will they be using their mouse? Will they be using their finger on a touchscreen? And cognitively, how will they be interacting with your website? But there's more than just that. From what region are they going to be interacting with your website, and on what device? What time of the day is it when they're interacting with your website? And even, are they doing something like holding a baby in their other hand? So they need to interact with your website only using one hand. The goal of this question is to frame in our heads that our website should be accessible to every person, all people. So that's a lot. It's a big task. Luckily, there's lots of organizations and tools that can help guide our journeys. So we'll talk about one right now. I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's W3 is a accessibility, information accessibility organization, and they've come up with something called the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. It's a document that is now in version 3 as of January, I believe. And it's developed in cooperation with individuals and organizations all around the world, with the goal of providing a single shared standard for web content accessibility. So it basically, a bunch of people got together and decided, here are really important benchmarks that we need to aim for in order to make our web content as accessible as possible. It's a gigantic document, certainly would take me more than 25 minutes to read through here, but they actually do a really good job of distilling 4 big points for how to think about everything that they're talking about. And they came up with a nice pithy acronym, which is POUR. So this is how Google's Web Fundamentals distills POUR. The P is for perceivable. In other words, can users perceive the content on the site? So this helps us keep in mind that just because something is perceivable with one sense, such as sight, for instance, that doesn't mean that all users can perceive it. Beyond just perceiving the content, however, is it operable? Is your website operable? Can users use the components and navigate the content in your website? So for example, something that requires a hover interaction with a mouse can't be operated by someone who can't use a mouse or a touchscreen, who is only a keyboard user. Is it understandable? Can users understand the content, and can users understand the interface? And then is it consistent enough to avoid any confusion given different ways that users interact with the website? And of course, is it robust? Can the content be assumed by a wide variety of user agents, wide variety of browsers, and also devices? And does it work with assistive technologies such as screen readers? So thinking about all 4 of those things, let's go into some really basic initial accessibility checks for your website. These are really easy checks and things that are pretty easy to remember and focus on when we're building it from the ground up. I think this is the first one that everyone thinks about. That is the alt text, the tag that goes in, or the attribute that goes in an image tag. So basically, if an image conveys information that's useful for interacting with or understanding the web page, then it needs alt text. Please keep in mind that if an image is just decorative and people don't need to know about the image, then it should just have a null alt tag. So if it's just a picture that is sort of decorative, a screen reader doesn't need to know what that picture is. Really hot tip, make your alt tags functional. So for instance, if you've got a sort of a search bar with a magnifying glass picture right next to it, the alt tag for that magnifying glass should be search, not magnifying glass. The screen reader needs to know semantically what it is that that picture is doing, not necessarily exactly what it's a picture of. Color contrast. This is a big one. You can use your dev tools to check the color palette accessibility for various different kind of color blindnesses. And we'll show an example of this later on. But before we step away from this, this is something that I really recently learned. A lot of reading disabilities are helped by low luminance availability, which is to say dark mode. So having a dark mode option on your website makes it more accessible. Page titles, super simple. Make sure that the pages of your website have titles that briefly and adequately describe the page, and that each page's title is different and distinguishing. Let's quick go and look at what that is. So this is my basic website. It's a list of dinos that my son loves. As you can see, the title of this page is all dinos, and it appears in the tag up here. And if I open up add a dino, it has a different title, add a dino, right here. One thing to keep in mind and sort of watch out for, maybe a gotcha, is that a lot of websites will want the name of the website to go in every single one of the titles. So if my website's name is My Dinos List, you might be tempted to say My Dinos List, colon, all dinos. My Dinos List, colon, add a dino. That makes things difficult for a number of different reasons, especially when tabs are kind of squished up against one another. So it's always a good idea to say the reverse, to do it in the reverse. All dinos, colon, my dinos list. Add a dino, colon, my dinos list. Headings, super basic. Please make sure to order your headings hierarchically. H1 is larger than H2 for semantic reasons, not stylistic reasons. You always need to have one H1 tag. It's on every page. That's the main heading. That's the main focus, the main theme of the page. And all other headings are subheadings. So H2 is the subheading of H1. Now, you might have reason to make H2 larger than H1 for design reasons on your page, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Please style your H2 larger with CSS so that it remains an H2, but then appears larger than H1. A screen reader will automatically hone in on that H1 just to tell the user this is the focus of the site. Again, H1 is larger than H2 for semantic, not stylistic reasons. Browsers allow users to resize text on your site, right? We've all seen the little magnifying glass that makes the text larger. So when you resize the text, make sure that the site is usable at different text sizes. Couple things, make sure that the things don't suddenly overlap each other, and make sure that horizontal scroll boxes are not needed for larger font sizes. Horizontal scroll boxes are an accessibility nightmare, and you want to make sure that your text wraps rather than going into a horizontal scroll box. Let's look at a quick example here. So if we bump up the, actually I can just Control+, we can make this really big. Okay, so I've got a couple problems here. Actually, I've got one problem here. As you can see, I'm now overlapping with my added dino. I'm overlapping my dinos list there. So I would want to redesign this nav bar so that it also grows when I zoom in on the page. However, if I zoom in even more, we can see that Triceratops loves to eat plants, wraps. It does not horizontally, it doesn't create a horizontal scroll bar. And so that is a successfully accessible zoom in. I'll zoom back up here and shift back. Now, one quick note is the horizontal scroll boxes rule is really important for languages that read right to left or left to right. But for languages that read up to down, like Japanese sometimes does, you need to make sure to avoid vertical scroll boxes when you zoom in. Keep that in mind. So most browsers allow for tabbed navigation. This just means that you tab through your website and make sure all content is accessible via tabbing. Super simple. If you click up in the URL bar and tab through, tab, 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 it'll go to all the things. This works with forms as well. You can tab to the inputs and the submit button. Great, that seems to work nicely. So when we're tabbing through, make sure that you can access drop-down lists and menu bars with arrow keys. That's one big one. Make sure that there's no keyboard traps, which are elements on a page that can be tab navigated into, but not out of. Sometimes this happens with modals or things that are hidden off to the side of the page. You can tab into it and then you're stuck. You can't tab out. Make sure the visual focus is clear. So which element is being highlighted with each tab press? I think you saw that when I was tabbing through my links at the top of the page, there was a white bar that surrounded each link, and that helps you figure out where it is that you are when you're tabbing through. Double check that all functionality is accessible via the keyboard, so make sure that you can press enter on your buttons and that you can enter your drop-down lists, and you're all set. Forms. This is a bit of a tricky one. So first of all, for various reasons, make sure all form instructions are clear and appear before the form inputs in the HTML. There may be a reason that you want to style your page to have, for instance, form instructions somewhere else with an arrow pointing to what they are instructions for, the form. Make sure that the form instructions in your HTML is just before the form input so that a screen reader can parse the information. All form inputs need to have semantic label attributes in your HTML, and the labels need to be positioned logically on the page. We're going to show an example of that in a little bit. Make sure that required fields are clearly indicated and not with color alone. So you see this all the time. If there's a field that's required and you don't put any information there, the label will, for instance, turn red to indicate, hey, you need to put information here. That's not going to work for somebody with a screen reader. So it needs to be clearly indicated that a required field is required. If a user produces a form error, maybe an incorrectly formatted email address or a date, the error message should give clear and specific guidance for how to fix it, and the error message should be easily findable before the form, not after the form, to make it easy for someone using a screen reader to figure out what error message is attached to what input. And lastly, make sure that your label is clickable if your form element is clickable. So for instance, we often have radio forms like this, and these little radio buttons can be a little bit tricky for people who have trouble with fine motor movements. Only click radio here, it's really tricky. It can be really tricky to click on it. You can make bike clickable as well to make it much more accessible, so that if you want to click on this bike radio, you can click on bike. If you want to click on the your own 2 feet radio, you can click on the words your own 2 feet. These can be adversely affected by distracting content. It maybe moves, or content that blinks or flashes rapidly. So if you have content that auto scrolls or auto plays, please make sure that there's a way to stop or pause the content. Maybe this is a weather scroll ticker or some video ads, something like that. And then a big one, avoid content that blinks or flashes more than 3 times in any 1 second period. This is kind of the basic rule for how to avoid things that can trigger epileptic seizures. Content that blinks or flashes more than 3 times in any 1 second period. Make sure your multimedia has alternatives. Make sure, for instance, videos can be alternately consumed. This basically means that they should have either accurate captions and or transcriptions. Transcriptions are great, very useful for screen or braille readers. But if there are captions or subtitles, make sure that they're accurate. I think we've all seen that YouTube has some sort of automatic subtitles that are often less than accurate, which can actually be counterproductive for somebody who is not perceiving the audio. And lastly, just a quick note on basic structure. So a lot of accessibility helpers will linearize a site to make it more consumable. And I'll get into what that means, but you need to make sure your site is semantically understandable when it's linearized. So linearized means it organizes all the information from top to bottom, like all the sidebars, puts it in one top to bottom row. So how do we know? Use a browser extension like Web Developer. It's easy to download browser extension. And what you're going to do is turn off the images, turn off all the CSS styling, and linearize your page. So I'll give you an example of that. I've downloaded this easy toolbar here. This is called Web Developer. I'm going to disable all images. I'm going to disable all CSS, and I'm going to linearize the page. Great, and I can still, everything semantically makes sense, and I can still tab through it. So that's no problem. We're going to use this page again, so I will undo all that. Cool. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for being able to tab through everything, making sure the headings are where they belong, and then we can navigate to all the things. One quick note is that tables may not at all be readable when they're linearized, tables. So this can be mitigated by proper HTML labeling of the tables, even though once the page is linearized, it'll be really difficult to parse visually. Okay, let's briefly talk about ARIA. What is ARIA? ARIA are accessible rich internet applications. And very basically, ARIA is a set of HTML attributes that you give to your HTML elements. And they're really powerfully used to modify element semantics or add semantics where none exist. HTML, if it's used correctly, can be very semantic and easy to read for a screen reader, but as soon as you start doing more interesting stylistic things, it can make things really difficult for a screen reader. So this is where ARIA jumps in. I'll give a quick example. Let's talk about a custom checkbox. So this is just basic boilerplate HTML custom checkbox. I think we all know what they look like. And a screen reader can parse this. It's a checkbox, it knows it, and it knows if it's checked or not, as long as this is changed with your JavaScript. Normal HTML checkbox. But let's say you don't like the look of that checkbox and you want to style it and make it more interesting looking. Well, with good CSS, you can make a checkbox that just basically is in a list class or whatever, but style it properly with CSS and it looks like a great checkbox and it does all the things that a checkbox does, which is great. But for a screen reader, this is impossible to tell what it is. It looks just like a list element. It doesn't read the class and it just says list bike. And a screen reader doesn't know what to do with that. So that's where we can use ARIA. We give this custom checkbox a role checkbox. This is an ARIA tag role. So the screen reader knows what it is. And an ARIA checked, set it to true or false. And we can switch that with JavaScript when it's actually switched to true or false. So now you have a stylish looking custom made checkbox that is screen reader accessible again. Let's just look at 3 other helpful ARIA attributes. The ARIA label is a label that only a screen reader can read. And you can put it on almost any HTML element, which is super helpful. ARIA controls denotes what thing your div or your maybe control is controlling. So just as an example, let's say you've got this div ID, cool bikes. Maybe it's a carousel at the bottom of the page that rolls through cool bikes. And let's say you've got a scroll bar at the top of the page. And if you're looking at the website visually, it's very clear that the scroll bar is moving the cool bikes ID. But for a screen reader, it's quite tough to see that if there's content in between the two. So ARIA controls simply says, hey, this scroll bar is controlling cool bikes. And then the screen reader can inform the user how to use the scroll bar and what it affects. And lastly, ARIA Live. This one's a really interesting one. So let's say you have some content on your website that you can change with the push of a button. So let's say you can change a word that appears on screen. Let's say it makes a random word. And then there's a paragraph that explains how to use your button. So button, random word, shows a random word, and then a paragraph. Your screen reader will read the random word, and then it'll start reading the paragraph. And if you click the button to change the random word while the screen reader is reading, the screen reader won't know to go up and update and tell the reader the new random word. ARIA Live will change how the screen reader does it. And ARIA Live has several different levels of how polite it wants you to be in terms of how it wants the screen reader to interrupt what it's doing to tell you something has changed. If you set it to polite, the screen reader will wait until it's finished reading everything, and then it'll tell you that something has changed. You can go up several other levels all the way up to something that is rude. It's called rude. And if you set it to rude, then it'll interrupt what it's talking about right away, read that something has changed, and then come back to the paragraph. There are tons and tons of really helpful ARIA attributes. And ARIA comes with a lot of really popular frameworks. So for instance, if you're using Bootstrap, a lot of your elements will already have ARIA attributes built in. And we'll talk really soon about how you can check to see if you need an ARIA attribute. So lastly, let's look at some tools to help check your website's accessibility. We've already looked at Web Developer. We've already looked at we've already looked at Web Developer. Now we're going to look at a bunch of things that Chrome DevTools can do. And we're also going to look at Wave. So let's hop over to the website again. One thing we can use Chrome DevTools to do is to emulate vision, like color blindness, different kinds of color blindnesses. So if you go into this, I guess this is a hamburger menu with only 3, and go down to more tools and rendering. Right near the bottom of this scroll box down here will be something called emulate vision deficiencies. And you can emulate different sorts of color blindness. So people with protanopia are going to see the website like this. People with tritanopia are going to see the website like this, and so on and so forth. This is super helpful to see if your website is accessible for different vision deficiencies. So let's say you've got a big website and you just want to check to see if it is accessible in general. One thing you can use is in the Chrome DevTools, there's something called Lighthouse. And Lighthouse does a lot of different things. So we'll make sure that it's set to desktop and we'll have it generate a report. And it takes a while to generate this report. And the reason is not only is it checking if the website is accessible, but it's also checking a couple other things, the performance of the website and also how the search engine optimization works for the website. So that's great. That tells us a lot of information. But on a bigger website, it takes a long time. So there's one other tool that we can use, which is really helpful. And it's called Wave, which is a browser extension that you can download. I've downloaded it here. I'll go ahead and run it. And very quickly, it brings up kind of like a scorecard of how you're doing on this website. Let's head over to Delete a Dyno and check it out. Cool. So we've got two errors here. One of them here is this, well, let's click and see. This header has very low contrast between the text and the background colors. Okay, great. Let's dig into what that is later, I guess. Let's also look at this missing form label. So that's interesting. It says the form doesn't have a corresponding label, but I do have a label, dyno to delete. So let's check the code. Okay, I see here, the label is not actually hooked up to the input. So that's super easy to fix. If we jump in here, we can look at our label and we'll give it a 4, maybe call it delete. And then for the input, we'll give it an ID for delete, and that hooks up the label to the form. Great, and if we reset, we should be okay. Yep, and we have a nice green label there to tell us we've done a good thing. It is associated. So this one's a little trickier, right? Low contrast, which I get, I understand, right? There's low contrast between this color and the background color, cool. And if we really dig in, we can see that you want to have contrast more than 4.5 to 1. Good information, but how do I know how to do that? Well, actually, there's a really cool Chrome dev tool that can help you do that. So we open up let's inspect actually this element, the header here. And we can see that it's color green. If we click the color, we bring up this cool bar, this color box, and we can see that the contrast ratio is 1.94, which is not so good. And we want to aim for 4.5. So let's go ahead and just click around, try and find one that's 4.5 and still looks good. Yeah, I like that color. That's great. So I'll grab this hex and quick change the CSS, and we'll have no problem satisfying our, did I not grab it? Well, you get the understanding. So this is an incredibly powerful tool just to help us find the right color contrasts to work for our background. My son really likes pink and he chose this background color. So shareholders being what they are, I couldn't argue with him, which means it's my job to find colors for the rest of the content that make sure that the website is as accessible as possible. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with me. It's a big, big, big topic, and we could talk for days and days and days and still not scratch the surface. But I hope that I've given you some tools that you can use and some sort of thought processes that you can use. There's a lot of information out there. I found a lot of great information that I'd love for other people to check out. So please contact me later if you want to check out the bibliography here. But in general, thank you so much for listening to my talk and for paying attention to accessibility in all applications that you write. Thank you very much.